are more than 100 unique styles of beer, each with their own set of ingredients, process, guidelines, history, and experience. If you're a beer lover, an industry leader, or somewhere in between, a better knowledge of beer style will improve your life and your work.
Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style, essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. I'm Julia Herz.
And I'm Jeremy Storton.
We're advanced Cicerones, beer judges, home brewers, and we're excited to guide you through the vast and wonderful world of beer styles. Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Sense of Beer Style. Julia and Jeremy reliably here yet again. Hi, Jeremy. Sup?
Hi, Julia. Hello, everyone.
And I'm excited to have us in Land of European Sour Ale, Beer Judge Certification Program Style Guidelines, 23D Lambic. And wow, we need to do this with its companion show, the Goose, but we'll get to that. Let's one thing at a time. And this is a true gem of a style. If you are on the beer journey, if you're in beer studies, if you're a beer educator, if you're a beer leader, and if you want to know where beer can go, then you're going to come across Lambic, and you're going to, when you talk to others that are into beer about beer, Lambic's going to come up. This is a style from the great brewing region, an area of the world known as Belgium. And, that country taught us not just about aged beers with very yeast-influenced characteristics, but also beers that can be very young and fresh. And so this Lambic is a very, very sessionable, definitely sour. The unaged version, this style, the Lambic, usually less than 6 months old, drinking fresh, is often used and blended to create a whole new style. And we'll talk about that later in the Stylecast. But it really sets you up and piques your appetite, hopefully. And if you're drinking one, you're already in the journey, in the space to talk more about this, because there's a lot going on for a very young, sessionable, low ABV beer.
Here I am talking with and to the queen of homebrewing. I remember seeing a list of all the different beer styles and where they fall when it comes to, particularly from home brewers, but by extension commercial brewers as well. And there were like the beginner or easy to brew beers, probably like a pale ale or IPA or something like that. And then there were the intermediate beers that were a little bit trickier process wise or ingredient wise. And then there were the advanced. Is basically if you're a home brewer. Unless you're, that person, don't even bother. These are incredibly tricky. This is one of those beers that was terrifically advanced when it comes to just the brewing. It's one of those beer styles that, not everyone's going to enjoy right off the bat. You kind of have to develop a palate for these things. But when we talk about the ingredients and why are they so complicated, they're complex and they're complicated. So let's break this down. So first of all, we're going to start with a Pilsner malt, and we're going to add, I don't know, I think I said anywhere from 30 to 40% unmalted wheat, not malted, unmalted wheat. And then we're going to create, in that very first step, we're going to create what's called a turbid mash. And what that means is we're trying to create sugars and carbohydrates for different phases of its fermentation life cycle. The small chain sugars, that's going to be for the regular brewer's yeast, the Saccharomyces. That's going to gobble that up and create fermentation. But we also need some very complex, big chain carbohydrates that our basic brewer's yeast can't touch, because we want to save food for the other fermentation critters in there, Brettanomyces, Pediococcus, Lactobacillus, because those are going to very slowly, over a long time, a year or more, are going to take that food and slowly chomp away at it, those larger complex carbohydrates. And creating that turbid mash creates all the different kinds of sugars and carbohydrates that all of these different critters need in order to create this very unique beer. So that's what a turbid mash is. We're also going to use, and this is kind of a foreign thing for people who just love regular beer, we're going to use aged hops. Now, anyone who's studied hops and or the off flavors, we know we don't want isovaleric acid. We don't want our beer to be cheesy or smell like sweat socks from, my 13-year-old teenage son. But aged hops are used for preservative, not for bitterness, not really for flavor. It's just for the preservative value. Then after we brew this, we're going to stick these in oak, neutral oak. So we're not going to get oakiness, but we're going to get a little bit of tannins. We're going to get a little bit of that culture, but it's really a fermentation forward style. It's the flavor of all these critters. And on top of that, this is typically spontaneous fermentation. This is where you, after you boil this, then you put it into a big shallow pan called a cool ship. You open up the windows, you go home, you come back the next morning, it's going to cool down, and whatever critters have gotten into the air are going to be what starts fermenting it. So that's a spontaneous fermentation. This is just a very beautiful, unique way of brewing beer. And by extension, this has gone out to different places around the world to create beers just like this, like DeGard in Oregon, Jester King in Texas. There's a lot of people who are trying to play with this style, and it's very difficult, but it's very wonderful. Anyway, that's ingredients. Let's talk about what the beer looks like.
Yes, and what the beer looks like and ends up tasting like, it is a aspect of what was on hand, right? These are known
Yeah.
to be one of the examples when people bring up the term farmhouse ales. This is it, right? You have those hops aging at the top of the barn, and there's high heat, and it's advancing those hops. But a brewer found out that using those hops didn't just bring bitterness, but it helped preserve the beer. So even though all the aromatic aspects of those hops and often the flavor of those hops was diminished, those aged hops had a great purpose. The turbid mash is based on the equipment that was available centuries ago, right? Jeremy's throwing out a lot of things, and I love it. Hopefully you're pausing if you don't know what isovaleric is, or you'd never heard of turbid mash or a cool ship, and your brain goes and looks those terms up and then comes back. We'll always be here. That's the nature of recording. So take your time, pause, just like when you're doing a workout online. If you need to catch your breath, do that, and stay with us on these concepts, because we want the show to be not just about advanced brewers and those interested in beer, but also the beginner. We're going to challenge the beginner with advanced notions. And when you get to a style like Lambic, those advanced notions and concepts are all over the place, even though this is one of the more aged and been around forever styles, just based on the virtue of what was available to the brewers in Belgium. And so with that, we finally get to appearance. And you're going to have a beer based on the ingredients that Jeremy talked about, particularly that wheat, where it's really more pale yellow, barely straw, more darker yellow to gold color. The age will darken it, right? That's always going to darken a beer. The clarity is hazy to good. That doesn't really help you out any, but the style guidelines point out the younger the beer is, the more cloudy it is. Then as it ages, it will clarify. That should and kind of could make sense to you. And then you're going to have a white collar of foam, certainly, but it's going to dissipate very, very quickly, and poor collar of foam or retention. Don't expect that. It's more about the beverage itself and the CO2 or carbon dioxide that's rising, hopefully, in the glass as you hold it.
Yeah. When it comes to aroma, I'm just going to, again, kind of a note on complexity. This is one of those holy wow beers. There's so much going on. So from a simple standpoint, understand that this is a fermentation forward beer. We have malt forward beers. We have hop forward beers like IPAs. This is a fermentation forward beer. So the base malt is just going to be very light, bready, grainy, maybe honey, maybe a little bit of wheat, kind of aromas coming through. But that's just your base note. When you start thinking about the complex aromas that are coming out, you might be a little confused or overwhelmed and not sure where to start. That's perfectly normal with a beer like this. But some of the words we use to describe this is barnyard. Now, if you have never been to a barnyard or a petting zoo or a regular zoo or anything like that, then it's really hard to describe this. And this really gets to a personal experience. If you don't know what skunk smells like, because like you're from India, then it's hard to say that this beer is skunky. So it really pays to visit a petting zoo, or if you know anyone with cattle or goats or anything like that, just do a drive-by, roll down your window and take a whiff. And that's reminiscent of these beers. And we're using a lot of words that when you say them out loud, it sounds awful. But when you taste it, when you smell it, I mean it in the best way possible. But we're talking barnyard, we're talking rodeo, we're talking petty zoo, earthy, sweaty goat, sweaty horse, horse blanket that hasn't been washed. You can get complex fruit like different kinds of citrus. You can get their white pith, the rind, palm fruits, rhubarb. Now, the guidelines say that you're typically not going to get smoky aromas out of this, and I agree. I've never smelled smoky. Um, it also says nothing. It shouldn't be cheesy from those aged hops, but it also says it shouldn't have any tobacco notes. I disagree politely because the one time I actually got to taste Cantillon from Draft, I got this just beautiful wet cigar note out of it, and I loved it. So you judge for yourself, but one of the other things to just be mindful of is you should not smell hops. You should smell all fermentation. Um, you might smell something that makes you think a word you don't want to say out loud. There's a word for that word we don't want to say out loud when we're talking about something we want to consume. Uh, and the word we want to say is poop. Nothing. You smell poop. You're like, I don't want to eat that. I don't want to drink that. There are fancy words to suggest. You go to a rodeo and it has that familiar smell. Poop is part of it. Um, the word enteric.
Enteric,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. Indole is that word that just basically for me that describes a rodeo ground. Enteric is another word that is kind of reminiscent of like or it has a nod to like your gut and your intestines. These are fancy words to say, it has this earthy smell, but in the nicest way possible. So don't let that put you off. It's weird. I know. I hate it when I say it out loud, but it really is a beautiful thing to experience. Let's take this to flavor and see if that gets any better.
Yeah, and the style guidelines totally cheat. They literally say funky notes, right? Jeremy just
Yep.
waxed poetic for 2 minutes on all this, and then the style guidelines are like funky
And
notes.
then I start talking about
I
poop.
think it's funny because when you do talk about yeah. But when you do talk about wild fermentation, and if you've heard the show before, I often bring up the term that pecking order of fermentation agents, everything from Saccharomyces, which is your standard Cerevisiae yeast, ALN lager, and then you've got Lactobacillus, Pediococcus, Acetobacter, Brettanomyces, which has more than 10 different strains, right? All of these things come into the environment. So when you're doing this type of fermentation and inviting that, it is going to go to funky, but I'd love to see the style guidelines go a little deeper on
Yeah.
what it's describing. So you're looking when you taste this, really, you're going to get a note of that lactic sourness. It's going to calm with age, right? Anything that's more acidic will round out and calm with age. And you're going to get everything from that barnyard to horse blanket to tobacco and leather, to more lactic yogurt sourness, which is more of a clean sourness. It just depends on who brewed it, how aged it is, and frankly, how it was conditioned as well. And you're not really going to get a sense of bitterness, right? You've got the hops in there as a preservative aspect, but not really bitterness. And you will get the base fermentable wheat in many forms, is going to bring this bready flavor, right? It could be perceived like sourdough bread in a cup, right, in a glass. It is got that, but then it's got even more deep, complex nuance beyond that. It's drier, and as it sits and ages, it will become more drier. So it's very, very quenching and refreshing. And I'm gonna stick with that and keep it simple because the aroma really everything Jeremy described, so much of it does fall into the flavor as well.
Yeah. Well, and I'll add one more thing to that before we get into mouthfeel too. And this is something something you just said, Julia, just kind of conjured a memory. When these are, if you have a younger lambic, there's going to be more body, and depending on his age, probably in the first 6 months, you might actually start getting notes, or at least from my experience, notes of like an overripe pineapple. And that is just a beautiful thing. It's like overripe. It's like, we should have ate it yesterday, but we're not going to throw it out. that flavor right there, I've tasted in a few different younger lambics. As it gets older, and as the Brettanomyces and the Pediococcus and Lactobacillus have a chance to really, really work, particularly the Brett, it is going to get drier. It is going to that fruity flavor is going to kind of get processed, and we are going to get some of those more earthy rodeo like flavors that come out in again the most beautiful way. But along with that comes that mouthfeel. It's hard to pin down mouthfeel because at what point are you drinking this? Is it a young version? It's going to have more body. If it's an older version, it's going to be, very light body, maybe dry as a bone. And so the fun thing is, if you taste one of these and you assess the mouthfeel, you can also form a conclusion as to its age. And that body will kind of correlate with that. If it's younger, it might be fruitier, not quite as sour. If it's older, it'll be earthier and quite sour. Um, you should not have a very pronounced astringency, but it's going to be there. It is aged in oak after all. Here's the funny thing about carbonation, though, with these. If you have these on draft, there should be no carbonation. They should be almost perfectly still, if not perfectly still. If you drink this from a bottle, there might be some bottle conditioning. It might be lightly effervescent, but that's going to depend on age as well. And so it's really hard to pin down mouthfeel because it depends on what version of this beer style we're talking about. So that's mouthfeel. Let's talk about the style comparisons.
Yeah, and there really is only one style. So set aside a
Yeah.
weeknight, go back to back shows, and get to Goose. We will record it soon. This was recorded
Yep.
first, going in order of the 2021 guidelines. And so it's a less aged, less complex version, certainly less blended because it's the base for blending. Different ages of lambics are then blended as a Goose. So get a Goose. That's a different style, even though this is the base style for that. So simpler, less sour, less developed and advanced funky flavors than a Goose. And traditionally, the style guidelines talk about and practice in Belgium is it's served uncarbonated from pitchers, right? It might even be served straight from the fermentation vessel to the glass. So carbonation isn't a big aspect of the unaged these lambic versions, but Goose is known to be very carbonated, highly carbonated. So if you're blind
Mm-hmm.
tasting, that's something to look for, and a good way to know potentially which one you're getting is high carbonated, probably aged, probably blended in Goose, not as carbonated or uncarbonated, likely lambic.
Yeah. So some commercial examples. The very first time I got to taste this beautiful advanced style, I was sitting at a brewery in Tillamook, Oregon, near the coast. Called DeGard Brewery, fantastic brewery. Shout out to them. But they do their lambic inspired brewery that does spontaneous fermentation in a cool ship as well as saisons and other things too. Please go visit them. Tell them I said hello. But I was there at their brewery and they actually had a keg of Cantillon Grand Cru on tap, and I thought, as one would expect, holy expletive, I need one of those. So I got one of those, and it was that combination of leather and cigar and I don't even know what. My palate was not well trained then, but I'm not sure if I like it, but I kept going back to be thorough, but next thing you knew, it was gone. But that Cantillon Grand Cru is one of the ground zeros for this style. Basically, look for the lambic on the label, but some of the common ones are Decam, Boone, Fontinen, Lindemans, and I haven't seen this one, but Timmermans as well. But you'll find some of these beers in different breweries around the world, in the U.S., wherever, but they have to be spontaneous fermentation. They hopefully they say lambic, but if you can't find some of these classics, then go to some of these breweries that do something along these lines and just ask them, hey, what is your beer that's most like lambic? They'll probably hand you a Goose. That's okay. We'll talk about the different style cast, but at least you'll get a sense of it. That's my advice in trying to find a good lambic.
I love
How
it.
about
And I'll point out too that this is a great example of beer's terroir, right? We hear a
No,
lot about
yes.
terroir for growing grapes and wines, but terroir can also be not just the actual ingredients, but the environment that a beer is made in. So this is terroir in a glass for sure. And that's what comes to mind as Jeremy's sharing the different commercial examples, because terroir is not reproducible. Right? Vintage to vintage for wine, they are ecstatic to get back to what the previous year's version is. But
Hmm.
Mother Nature doesn't allow for that in the variableness of soil temperatures, weather, sunshine, etc. And the same would go for these beers that are, spontaneously fermented. That's going to have so many variables that one example isn't exactly the next. So the fun is trying different examples. Go for
Well,
those.
and this is a fun little clip too. But if you ever hear about those breweries that refuse to clean the cobwebs and take any of the dust off the rafters, these are Lambic brewers. If you ever heard the story of Lindemans, they set up in a new facility and they took some walls down from the old facility, put them up in the new one, and sprayed the walls with some of their wort just to try to recreate that terroir so that they can maintain the same beer. um, Julia, you put it perfectly. This is terroir driven. It's fermentation, spontaneous fermentation driven. So they're very superstitious. Any change, any cleaning, you might change the recipe. So they're very careful about that.
Absolutely. So we're going to get you going and home stretch here, vital statistics, and then a few more things in your studies. Original gravities of these are paid attention to just to get to your desired alcohol by volume. 1040 to 1054 is going to be where we start. That's potential fermentable sugars. Final gravity is fascinating, and it's an easy one to remember because there's 2 ones. There's actually 4 ones in this, and it's the only one that is like this in the style guidelines. Final gravity of 1001 to 1010. That's a huge range. 1010 has residual sugar for sure. 1001 is virtually no residual sugar. So good range to remember. They can be very dry or actually have a bump of sugar that you're definitely going to notice. That is going to take us to an alcohol by volume of 5% to 6.5%. So these are not going to barrel you over. You can have several. You are going to be able to enjoy yourself. And this is not a big alcohol beer. And then international bitterness units. We mentioned the use of hops, mostly aged hops for preservative qualities, as well as a barely discernible bitterness, 0, so no international bitterness units, to 10 bitterness units. You barely can discern bitterness at 8 IBUs and above, or 8 IBUs and below. So 10 is saying it's really not a bitter beer. And then standard reference method is 3 to 6. I talked about kind of that barely pale straw or more yellow color to dark gold. Well, that's where we are at for color. And then Jeremy, if you want to jump in, you don't have to, but you could always do conversions because I know you would like to help out our international listeners as well.
Sure. When we're talking about color and we're talking about European Brewery Convention, we just doubled the SRMs. We got 6 to 12. As far as gravities go, for the original Plato folks, we're looking at 10 to 13.5. And the final Plato folks, we're looking at 0 to 2.5 because they can get quite dry. And if you look at Plato in terms of alcohol, we're looking at around 10 to 11 or so. But that's just a little translation to people in different parts of the world. Now, this is kind of fun. Let's talk about the glass type and temperature. I do like this to be a little chilled, but this beer is going to go through vast, incredible, and just wonderful changes as it warms up. So I urge you to pull it out cold, take a sip, and let it sit for 10, 15, 20 minutes. Take your time drinking this because it's going to change. It's going to change in wonderful, wonderful ways. What we typically serve this beer in, you can put it in whatever you want, but a typical glass for this would be like a French water glass. Or if you think about those water glasses that has 5 or 6 sides on it, it's typically just a ordinary boring water glass in most restaurants. There's a slightly fancier version of that, and that's typically what this beer goes into. The other aspect about this as well is if you're getting a lambic from a bottle, there's going to be a lot of sediment left over. And so we want to hold that bottle perfectly upright and perfectly still as long as we can. And when you typically uncork it and when you go pour glasses, be very careful about just holding it just enough to pour And don't turn it upright and pour, upright and pour. Don't do that. It's going to get cloudy. You're going to mix it all up. What we want to do is hold it at an angle and just pour the next glass, bring the next glass to it and pour it a little bit more, bring the next glass and hold it as still as we can. This is one of the other ways that they do this is they actually have a lambic basket where they put the beer in this basket that holds it at an angle and is meant to pour it almost like a watering can for flowers. It's the same type of thing for this particular beer. It's very unique, but we want to try and get it as still and clear as possible. Let's talk about pairings.
Beer pairings are always so fun to try and experiment, so do just that. But because of the advanced nature of the spontaneous fermentation, and as these beers are more developed, they're going to even get more broad spectrum of that kind of funky notes. I'm going to suggest goat cheese, right? You want something.
Ooh,
Goat
yeah.
cheese is often a little waxy. Caprylic is a flavor component that comes up. And that goat cheese could have fresh peaches sliced over it. And you're going to put it maybe with some bruschetta or toast. And then the beer, as I said, which kind of can be considered an advanced sourdough in a glass, you're going to use that as the bread on the side of your cheese and your fruit. And you're going to have a party.
Yeah. I would love to use the nature, the flavors of this one, the fermentation character, first of all, and the acidity of this beer. Granted, we're not going to have typically much carbonation to use to scrub our palate, so I want to be mindful of that as well. But I want to use all those attributes to find something that's harmonious and maybe something that kind of contrasts. That goat cheese, I think, would be wonderful because you might have a cancellation effect with the gamey, goaty funkiness of it, and you might reveal some different flavors that you didn't notice before. That could be awesome. I would love it. If I'm in Belgium, I'm probably going to have some fish with this, hopefully some diver scallops, hopefully some gray shrimp croquettes, because we're in Belgium after all. That would just be beautiful with the stuff to have those flavors, have that gaminess of it to go with the brininess of the sweet buttery flavor of the scallops and the fish. I think that would be a home run.
I love it. And I'm going to want to put spicy hot mustard on the scallops. And I've had scallops seared once that wasn't fortunate enough to pair with a lambic, but I can see it in all aspects. I love it. Go for it. Scallop on for sure.
Yep. Anyway, this is not an entry-level beer. This is not the beer to hand to your friends who just finished a Coors Banquet. Said, "Hey, you want to try a real beer? Try this." That might turn your friend off. This is something that I'm going to be honest. You kind of need to work your way up to this. You need to develop a palate, develop an appreciation, develop an understanding of the cultural and historical everything that goes into this beer before we can really just appreciate it. I'm not going to lie. This takes some time.
I would say give yourself allowances. If you don't gravitate to the taste the first time you try a lambic, then challenge yourself and have it again and again and again.
Yep.
And before you know it, you're going to be turning people on to this beer style.
Yeah. If nothing else, in the name of science.
That's right. Cheers, y'all. Thanks
Cheers.
for listening and watching.
Thank you for listening to A Sense of Beer Style, the essential beer style training for those who want to lead in food and beverage. With advanced Cicerones, me, Julia,
And me, Jeremy.
Tune into the next episode as we continue exploring the world of beer styles and what to make of them. We encourage you to listen to the prepisodes to build your foundation and better understand beer styles.
And before the next episode, I'd like to ask you to review the show and let us know what you'd like featured in upcoming episodes. Until next time, here's to you and your sense of beer style. Thank you for listening. Cheers.